The screech of tires cut through the midnight air like a blade tearing through silence. It wasn't the casual squeal of someone turning too fast into the North Point fuel station, but the desperate, violent sound of predators cornering their prey. 3 masked figures surrounded a sleek, black sedan, its engine still running, exhaust steaming in the cold October night. Inside the car, Evelyn Carrowan, the razor-sharp CEO of Titan Industries and one of the most powerful women in corporate America, found herself face to face with a nightmare she'd only seen in movies. But she wasn't alone in that parking lot. Behind the bulletproof glass of the station's night window stood Daryl Fenmark, a quiet single father working the graveyard shift, oil-stained uniform hanging loose on his tired frame. He wasn't supposed to get involved. Protocol said to hit the panic button and duck. But when those hijackers made their move, something older than fear kicked in. Something forged in places where hesitation meant death. In the next 12 minutes, this unassuming gas station attendant would do something that would leave hardened criminals unconscious, corporate executives speechless, and an entire city questioning everything they thought they knew about heroism. If stories of hidden strength, second chances, and the kind of courage that emerges from the most unexpected places move your heart, stay with us. This one might just shatter everything you believe about ordinary people. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The night air at North Point fuel station carried the scent of diesel fumes and autumn rain, a combination that had become as familiar to Daryl Fenmark as his own breathing. He stood behind the reinforced glass of the overnight booth, fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across his weathered face, watching the empty highway stretch into darkness beyond the gas pumps. It was 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in October, the kind of quiet shift where the biggest excitement usually came from a trucker needing directions or a college student counting change for energy drinks. Daryl preferred it this way. Quiet meant predictable, and predictable meant he could focus on the textbook open beside the cash register, studying for his automotive certification exam, while earning the overnight differential that helped keep food on the table and his apartment rent current. At 34, Daryl had learned to appreciate boring. His daughter Emma was asleep in their small apartment 12 miles away, safe under the watchful eye of Mrs. Patterson from next door, who never asked questions about his unusual work schedule or why a man with his obvious intelligence was working graveyard shifts at a gas station. Some people understood that life took unexpected turns, and sometimes those turns meant swallowing pride and doing whatever it took to provide stability for the people who mattered most. The black sedan appeared without warning, materializing from the darkness like a predator emerging from deep water. Its headlights swept across the empty lot as it pulled smoothly toward pump number 3, the engine purring with the expensive quietness that marked German engineering. Daryl glanced up from his textbook, noting the license plate automatically. Force of habit from years when attention to detail meant the difference between coming home and not coming home at all. The woman who stepped out of the driver's seat moved with the kind of confidence that came from boardrooms and corner offices. Even in the harsh fluorescent lighting, her tailored black suit looked like it cost more than Daryl made in 2 months. She was tall, probably in her early 40s, with dark hair pulled back in a style that suggested she didn't have time for complicated morning routines. Everything about her spoke of power, success, and the kind of life where midnight stops at gas stations were probably rare occurrences. Evelyn Carrowan, though Daryl didn't know her name yet, had been driving for 6 hours straight, pushing through exhaustion and 3 cups of truck stop coffee to make it back to Millbrook City for an emergency board meeting scheduled for 7 a.m. As the CEO of Titan Industries, one of the largest manufacturing conglomerates on the East Coast, she was accustomed to demanding schedules and impossible deadlines. What she wasn't accustomed to was the isolation of empty highways and deserted gas stations in the middle of the night. She'd chosen this route specifically to avoid the heavier traffic of the interstate, a decision that now seemed less wise as she stood alone under the harsh lights, credit card in hand, surrounded by nothing but darkness and the distant sound of trucks on a highway she couldn't see. That's when the first vehicle appeared, a battered pickup truck, primer gray and rust-spotted, emerged from the shadows near the station's edge where the security lights barely reached. It moved slowly, deliberately, like a shark testing the waters around potential prey. Daryl's attention sharpened instantly, his body responding to danger signals honed by years of training. He'd tried hard to forget. The pickup stopped at the far edge of the lot, engine idling, headlights pointing toward the gas pumps where Evelyn stood with her back to the approaching threat. She was focused on the fuel pump's digital display, unaware that she was being watched, evaluated, chosen. 2 more vehicles materialized from different directions, a pattern that made Daryl's blood turn cold. This wasn't random. This was coordination. This was hunting. A white van pulled up near the station's exit, effectively blocking the most direct escape route. A dark SUV positioned itself at the opposite end of the lot, completing a loose triangle that would make it nearly impossible for the sedan to maneuver out of the trap. All 3 vehicles sat with engines running, headlights dark, waiting. Daryl's hand moved instinctively toward the silent alarm button mounted beneath the counter, but he stopped himself. The alarm would summon police, but police were at least 15 minutes away on a good night. In 15 minutes, whatever was about to happen would be long over. He watched. Evelyn replaced the fuel nozzle and walked toward the station's convenience store entrance, still oblivious to the danger closing around her. She moved like someone accustomed to safety, to predictability, to a world where midnight gas stations were just minor inconveniences rather than potential battlegrounds. The doors of the 3 vehicles opened simultaneously. 6 figures emerged from the shadows, moving with practiced efficiency that spoke of careful planning and previous experience. They wore dark clothing and baseball caps pulled low, faces obscured, but body language unmistakable in its intent. This wasn't a robbery. This was an abduction. Daryl felt something cold and familiar settling in his chest, a combination of fear and clarity that he'd hoped never to experience again. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for his cell phone, muscle memory warring with present reality. Part of him wanted to duck below the counter, hit the alarm, and let someone else deal with what was about to unfold. That was the safe choice. The smart choice. The choice that kept him alive to go home to Emma in the morning. But as he watched the figures converge on Evelyn Caraway, he saw something that made that choice impossible. She'd noticed them now, her confident stride faltering as survival instincts finally kicked in. She was reaching for her car door when the first man grabbed her arm, and Daryl heard her scream through the thick glass that separated them. It was a sound that cut through years of careful emotional distance, piercing defenses he'd built to keep the past buried. Suddenly he wasn't standing in a gas station in suburban Pennsylvania anymore. He was in a place where people screamed and others had the power to make those screams stop, where hesitation meant watching innocents die while safety glass and protocol and someone else's responsibility became excuses for cowardice. Daryl Fenmark had spent 8 years trying to forget what he was capable of when pushed beyond the point of acceptable losses. As he watched 3 men drag Evelyn Caraway toward the white van, while she fought with the desperate strength of someone who understood that getting into that vehicle meant disappearing forever, he realized that some things couldn't be forgotten. They could only be buried until circumstances demanded their resurrection. 12 hours earlier, the 42nd floor of the Meridian Tower in downtown Millbrook City hummed with the controlled chaos that marked the end of another quarter for Titan Industries. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of the urban sprawl below, where millions of people lived their lives unaware that decisions made in boardrooms like this one would ripple through their employment, their communities, and their futures for years to come. Evelyn Caraway stood at the head of a mahogany, conference table that cost more than most people's annual salaries, her fingers drumming against its polished surface as she reviewed quarterly projections that painted a picture of unprecedented growth and equally unprecedented challenges. At 43, she had built Titan Industries from a regional manufacturing firm into a multinational corporation through a combination of strategic brilliance, relentless work ethic, and an unwillingness to accept limitations that others considered immutable. The boardroom around her reflected the kind of power that came from making decisions that affected thousands of jobs and millions of dollars with surgical precision. Awards lined the walls, recognition from industry organizations and government agencies that acknowledged her leadership in manufacturing innovation and economic development. But success at this level came with costs that weren't reflected in quarterly reports or shareholder presentations. 20-3 miles away, in the Oakwood Garden Apartments on the less affluent side of Millbrook City, Daryl Fenmark was helping his 7-year-old daughter, Emma, with her homework at a kitchen table that wobbled despite his repeated attempts to fix it. The apartment was clean but sparse, furnished with the kind of practical pieces that prioritized durability over aesthetics. Emma's drawings covered the refrigerator, bright crayon landscapes that depicted worlds where problems could be solved with imagination and where heroes always won. The contrast between these two worlds would have been obvious to any observer, but the distance between them was measured in more than geography or income. Evelis inhabited a realm of corporate jets and international conferences, where problems were solved through strategic acquisitions and market positioning. Daryl's world was smaller but no less complex, defined by shift schedules and homework assignments, by the constant calculation of whether Emma could afford new shoes this month, or whether the car would make it through another inspection. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Neither of them would have predicted that their lives would intersect in a gas station parking lot in the middle of the night, or that when they did, the encounter would reveal truths about strength, purpose, and the hidden reserves of courage that ordinary people carry without realizing it. The emergency that had pulled Evelis away from her corner office and onto empty highways began with a phone call at 4:30 p.m. Kieran Dravith, Titan's chief financial officer and one of the few people whose judgment she trusted completely, had discovered irregularities in their European subsidiary that demanded immediate attention. Not the kind of irregularities that could be handled through conference calls and email chains, but the kind that required her physical presence and the authority that came with it. The Frankfurt office has been operating outside established parameters for at least 6 months, Kieran had explained, his usually steady voice tight with controlled urgency. We're looking at potential regulatory violations, possible criminal liability, and at minimum a complete restructuring of our European operations. The implications were staggering. Titan Industries employed over 40,000 people across 6 countries. Their manufacturing facilities produced everything from automotive components to medical devices, products that formed invisible links in supply chains that connected with people's daily lives in ways most consumers never considered. A scandal in Frankfurt wouldn't just affect shareholders and executives. It would ripple through communities where Titan facilities provided economic stability for entire regions. Evelis had built her career on the Wenbo principle that leadership meant being present when presence mattered most. While other CEOs might delegate crisis management to subordinates, she believed that the weight of decision-making couldn't be transferred to people who wouldn't bear the ultimate responsibility for consequences. It was this philosophy that had earned her the respect of employees and competitors alike, but it was also what put her on a highway at midnight, driving toward a board meeting that could determine the future of everything she'd spent 2 decades building. Meanwhile, Daryl was settling into what he expected would be another quiet night at North Point Fuel Station. The job wasn't glamorous, but it served purposes beyond the paycheck that appeared in his account every 2 weeks. The overnight shift meant he could be home when Emma got ready for school and be there when she returned in the afternoon. It meant avoiding the kinds of social interactions that might lead to questions about his background, about the gap in his employment, history that stretched from his 26th birthday until Emma was 3 years old. The station itself occupied a strategic location at the intersection of Highway 202 and the Millbrook Bypass, close enough to the city to attract commuter traffic, but far enough out to serve the truckers and travelers who preferred to avoid urban congestion. During daylight hours, it bustled with activity. Business people grabbed coffee and breakfast sandwiches. Construction workers filled thermoses and bought lottery tickets. Families on road trips stocked up on snacks and used the clean restrooms that Daryl kept meticulously maintained. But at night, especially on weeknights, the station became a different place entirely. The fluorescent lights that seemed warm and welcoming during the day cast harsh shadows across empty pavement. The sounds of traffic faded to an occasional whisper of tires on distant asphalt. The sense of isolation became palpable, a reminder that civilization's comforting presence was more fragile than most people realized. Daryl had chosen this isolation deliberately. After Emma was born and it became clear that he needed to reconstruct his life around new priorities, he'd sought employment that offered minimal complexity and maximum flexibility. The overnight shift at North Point provided both, along with something else he'd needed: the opportunity to disappear into routine, to become the kind of person who could blend into the background of other people's lives without attracting attention or raising questions. The owner, Malvin Caraith, had hired him based on a brief interview and references from his previous employer at a small auto repair shop. Malvin didn't probe into personal history or ask about the gap in Daryl's resume. He cared about reliability, honesty, and the ability to handle the responsibilities that came with being alone in a business that dealt with cash, fuel, and the unpredictable variety of people who stopped at gas stations in the middle of the night. For 3 years, this arrangement had worked perfectly. Emma was thriving in school, making friends, participating in activities that filled her life with the kind of normal childhood experiences that Daryl had sometimes wondered if he'd be able to provide. His own life had achieved a stability that felt like luxury after years of uncertainty. He was building toward goals that seemed achievable, completing his automotive certification, finding day shift work with better pay, maybe eventually saving enough to move to a house with a yard where Emma could have a dog. These were modest ambitions compared to corporate empire building, but they represented something equally valuable: the possibility of redemption, the chance to build a future that honored the sacrifices made to reach this point. Neither Evelyn nor Daryl could have anticipated that their carefully constructed worlds were about to collide in ways that would test everything they'd built and reveal capabilities they'd either forgotten or never knew they possessed. First thing people noticed about Daryl Fenmark was how easily they forgot him. At 5'9" with sandy brown hair that he cut himself to save money, wearing the standard issue uniform shirt of North Point Fuel Station over faded jeans that had been washed so many times the mighty original blue had become a soft gray, he moved through the world with the practiced invisibility of someone who had learned that being overlooked was often safer than being seen. His coworkers during shift changes knew him as reliable but quiet, the kind of man who always showed up on time, never called in sick, and kept the station running smoothly through long nights without complaint. To the regular customers who stopped by during his shifts, he was courteous but unremarkable, efficient at his job, but not someone who invited conversation beyond the necessities of transaction. What they didn't see was the way his eyes never stopped moving, cataloging details with the automatic precision of someone whose survival had once depended on noticing everything. They didn't notice how he positioned himself to maintain clear sight lines to all entrances, or how his hands remained steady even when dealing with difficult customers whose behavior would rattle most people. They certainly didn't suspect that the quiet man who asked if they wanted their receipt had once been entrusted with responsibilities that affected the safety of entire communities. Daryl preferred it this way. Anonymity was a luxury he'd earned through years of being anything but anonymous, and he protected it carefully. When Emma asked why he worked at night instead of during the day like other fathers, he explained it simply. Night work paid better, and it meant he could be available during her school day if she needed him. This was true as far as it went. What he didn't explain was that night work also meant fewer interactions with people who might ask questions about his background, fewer chances for casual conversations that might lead to revelations about capabilities he'd tried hard to leave buried. The apartment they shared in Oakwood Gardens reflected the same careful balance between function and invisibility. It was clean and well-maintained but not memorable, furnished with pieces chosen for durability rather than style. Emma's presence brightened the space with artwork and school projects, with the accumulated treasures of childhood that transformed any space into a home. But Daryl's personal belongings remained minimal, almost institutional in their simplicity. His bedroom contained little beyond a bed, a small dresser, and a desk where he studied for his automotive certification when Emma was asleep. Books on engine repair and diagnostic procedures shared, space with Emma's school newsletters and permission slips for field trips. The only decorative item was a framed photo of Emma on her first day of kindergarten, grinning gap-toothed at the camera while clutching a backpack nearly as big as she was. What the photo didn't show, and what Daryl never discussed with anyone, was that he'd spent the morning of that first day of school sitting in his car outside the elementary school, paralyzed by anxiety that had nothing to do with normal parental concerns. For someone whose professional life had involved protecting people from threats they never knew existed, the prospect of sending his daughter into the world without his direct oversight had felt like the most dangerous thing he'd ever done. But Emma had adapted to school with the resilience that children possess in abundance, making friends and embracing learning with enthusiasm that reminded Daryl why he'd made the choices that brought them to this point. Her teachers described her as bright and engaging, quick to help classmates and eager to participate in classroom activities. She spoke proudly of her father to anyone who would listen, describing him as the smartest and strongest person she knew, though she had only the vaguest understanding of why he sometimes seemed sad when he thought she wasn't watching. The sadness, when it came, was usually triggered by moments when the past intruded on the present, despite his efforts to keep them separate. A news report about international conflicts, a movie depicting scenarios that felt too familiar, the occasional nightmare that left him awake and watchful until dawn. These were the costs of carrying experiences that couldn't be shared with civilian counselors or discussed in normal social contexts, the price of having lived through situations that existed outside most people's understanding of possibility. Daryl had learned to manage these episodes through routine and focus. His textbooks on automotive repair served as more than career preparation. They were meditation objects, complex enough to require complete attention, but practical enough to feel useful. The precision required for diagnostic work appealed to the part of his mind that had been trained to solve problems through systematic analysis and careful attention to detail. His supervisors at North Point had noticed his aptitude for troubleshooting, the equipment failures that occasionally plagued the fuel pumps and card readers. What started as informal assistance during emergencies had evolved into unofficial responsibility for maintenance issues that arose during his shift. Malvin Caraith had mentioned the possibility of additional compensation for these duties, maybe even a transition to day shift work that would offer better opportunities for advancement. These were positive developments, signs that the life he was building with Emma was progressing toward greater stability and opportunity. But they also represented a form of exposure that made him nervous. Recognition meant visibility, and visibility meant the possibility that someone might begin asking questions about qualifications that seemed unusually sophisticated for a gas station attendant. The truth was that Daryl possessed skills that extended far beyond fuel pump maintenance and customer service. His understanding of mechanical systems had been forged in environments where equipment failure meant more than customer inconvenience. His ability to remain calm under pressure had been developed through experiences that would have broken many people. His instinctive assessment of threat levels and escape routes reflected training that civilian employers neither expected nor necessarily wanted in their staff. But these capabilities remained dormant by choice, buried beneath layers of deliberate normalcy that he'd constructed to protect both Emma and himself. He'd spent 3 years proving that he could be trusted with ordinary responsibilities, that the intensity that had once defined his professional identity could be channeled into the kind of steady reliability that made him valuable to employers and trustworthy to neighbors. What he hadn't anticipated was that some situations don't respect the boundaries that people draw around their lives. Some circumstances demand responses that can't be found in employee handbooks or parenting guides, that require accessing capabilities that might be deeply buried but never truly lost. As Daryl watched the 3 vehicles position themselves around Evelyn Carowin's sedan, he felt those buried capabilities stirring like muscles awakening from long disuse. The analytical part of his mind was already cataloging details: 6 attackers, coordinated positioning, professional-level planning that suggested experience and resources. The tactical part of his mind was calculating response options, assessing advantages and disadvantages, considering variables that most people wouldn't recognize as relevant. And the protective part of his mind, the part that had driven him to leave his previous life and build a new one centered around Emma's well-being, was recognizing that some battles choose the warrior rather than waiting for the warrior to choose them. The scream that cut through the night air hit Daryl like a physical blow, shattering the careful equilibrium he'd maintained for 3 years and triggering responses that he'd worked desperately to suppress. Through the reinforced glass of the station booth, he watched Evelyn Carowin struggle against 3 men whose movements spoke of professional experience and careful planning. This wasn't a random crime of opportunity. This was execution of a plan that had been developed by people who understood how to make someone disappear. His hand moved toward the silent alarm button mounted beneath the cash register. Muscle memory from countless safety training sessions, overriding the deeper instincts that were beginning to stir. Protocol was clear. Activate emergency response, secure the facility, wait for law enforcement to handle the situation. It was the smart choice, the safe choice, the choice that kept minimum wage employees from becoming casualties in situations beyond their training or authority. But as his fingers touched the alarm button, Daryl's tactical mind was already calculating the mathematics of response time versus criminal efficiency. Millbrook County Sheriff's Department averaged 12 minutes to reach North Point on emergency calls, 15 minutes during overnight shifts when coverage was reduced. The nearest state police barracks was 18 minutes away under ideal conditions. Emergency medical services operated on similar timelines, assuming they were even needed after law enforcement secured the scene. 12 minutes was an eternity when measured against the speed of professional abduction. In 12 minutes, the white van could be 50 miles away on any of a dozen different routes that led to industrial districts where screams wouldn't be heard, or rural areas where evidence could be disposed of without witnesses. In 12 minutes, Evelyn Carowin would transition from victim to statistic, another unsolved case in a file that would gather dust while her family wondered what had happened and why. The attack was unfolding with the kind of coordinated precision that spoke of rehearsal and experience. 2 men held Evelus's arms while the third opened the van's sliding door, their movements economical and practiced. No wasted motion, no hesitation, no apparent concern about witnesses or security cameras. They'd chosen their target and their location with careful consideration of factors that would maximize their success and minimize their risks. What they hadn't factored into their planning was the presence of someone whose background had prepared him to recognize professional-level threats and respond with equal Professionalism. Daryl felt the familiar shift in perception that marked the transition from civilian mindset to something older and more dangerous. Time seemed to slow as his awareness expanded to encompass details that most people would miss. The way the attackers positioned themselves to block Evelus's view of potential help. The careful choreography that suggested they'd practiced this exact scenario. The absence of visible weapons that indicated confidence in their ability to control the situation through physical force. Alone. His breathing deepened and steadied as training that had been dormant for years began to resurface. The shaking in his hands stopped. The anxiety that had been his constant companion since Emma was born was replaced by a cold clarity that felt both foreign and familiar, like putting on clothes that had been stored for so long that you've forgotten how well they fit. Through the glass, he could see Evelus fighting with desperate strength, but her resistance was hampered by the kind of panic that affected people who had never faced genuine physical threat. Her movements were inefficient, driven by fear rather than strategy, burning energy that she couldn't afford to waste. She was struggling like someone drowning rather than someone fighting, and drowning people rarely save themselves without help. The leader of the group, distinguishable by the way the others deferred to his positioning, appeared to be issuing quiet instructions. His body language suggested irritation at Evelus's resistance, but not concern. This was a temporary problem that would be resolved through the application of additional force, if necessary. In his experience, victims eventually stopped fighting when they realized that cooperation offered the only possibility of survival. What he didn't realize was that he was being watched by someone who understood exactly what kind of situation was developing and what the likely outcomes would be if it continued to unfold according to their plan. Daryl's mind was working through calculations that had nothing to do with fuel pump maintenance or customer service. 6 attackers, probably armed but weapons not immediately visible. 3 vehicles positioned to control escape routes, suggesting familiarity with tactical deployment. A target who was fighting, but not effectively, whose struggles were actually making the situation more dangerous for herself by escalating the attackers' timeline and potentially forcing them to use methods that would leave evidence. His own advantages were limited, but real. The element of surprise, since they clearly hadn't identified him as a potential threat. Knowledge of the station's layout and the immediate surrounding area, including security features and potential defensive positions. Access to emergency communications that could bring help, though not quickly enough to affect the immediate situation. And buried beneath years of deliberate normalcy, capabilities that he'd hoped never to use again, but that remained as sharp as the day he'd first learned them. The decision crystallized in a moment that felt both instantaneous and eternal. Daryl could hit the alarm button, duck below the counter, and hope that Evelus Carowin would somehow survive the next 12 minutes. He could prioritize his own safety and Emma's future stability by avoiding involvement in a situation that wasn't his responsibility and wasn't within his authority to address. Or he could accept that some circumstances transcend job descriptions and personal safety, that there were moments when the only choice that mattered was the one between action and lifelong regret. Hand moved away from the alarm button toward the key ring attached to his belt. Among the keys that unlocked doors and secured equipment was one that accessed a storage room behind the station's main building, a room that contained cleaning supplies, maintenance equipment, and a few items that had nothing to do with gas station operations, but everything to do with the life he'd lived before Emma changed his priorities. As Daryl moved toward the booth's exit, his reflection in the security mirror showed a transformation that would have been invisible to most observers, but unmistakable to anyone who understood what they were looking at. The tired expression of a man working overnight shifts to support his daughter was being replaced by something altogether more dangerous. The careful posture of someone who had learned to avoid attention was shifting into the economical movement patterns of someone who had been trained to eliminate threats with maximum efficiency and minimum exposure. For 3 years, Daryl Fenmark had been a gas station attendant who happened to have an unusual background. As he stepped into the October night air, breathing deeply and feeling muscles respond to demands they hadn't faced since Emma was born, he was becoming something else entirely. The attackers dragging Evelyn toward the van had planned for many variables. They'd considered police response times, security camera angles, witness potential, and escape routes. They'd prepared for victim resistance, equipment failure, and the possibility of unexpected complications. What they hadn't planned for was the intervention of someone who had spent years learning how to make dangerous people disappear, and who was about to remember exactly how effective those lessons had been. The transformation began the moment Daryl's boots hit the asphalt outside the station booth. The October air carried the familiar sense of fuel vapors and autumn leaves, but now these ordinary smells mixed with something else, the metallic taste of adrenaline and the electric tension that preceded action. His movements lost the casual rhythm of a gas station attendant and acquired the purposeful economy of someone whose survival had once depended on eliminating threats before they could fully develop. The storage room behind the main building contained exactly what he remembered: cleaning supplies, maintenance equipment, and tucked behind a stack of oil absorbent, a duffel bag that hadn't been opened in 3 years. His hands worked without conscious direction, muscle memory guiding him through contents he'd hoped never to need again. The weight and balance of familiar tools settled into his palms like extensions of his own body, comfortable and terrible in their efficiency. Through the building's corner, he could see the abduction continuing according to the attacker's timeline. Evelyn was fighting with decreasing effectiveness as exhaustion and panic took their toll. The leader of the group was checking his watch, clearly operating according to a schedule that probably included contingency plans and predetermined decision points. Professional kidnapping was ultimately a business, and successful businesses maintained rigid adherence to tested procedures. What they couldn't have anticipated was intervention from someone whose own professional background had involved disrupting exactly these kinds of operations. Daryl circled wide around the building perimeter, using shadows and structural cover to approach from an angle that wouldn't trigger peripheral vision alerts. His breathing had settled into the controlled rhythm that maximized oxygen efficiency while minimizing noise. Every step was placed with deliberate care, avoiding debris and surface variations that might create sound. The part of his mind that calculated distances and timing was fully engaged, processing variables that civilian observers would never notice. The first attacker never saw him coming. The man positioned near the van's rear door was focused on his assigned responsibility, maintaining security while his colleagues handled victim control. His attention was directed toward potential threats from the highway and the station's front area, the logical directions from which interference might arrive. He wasn't scanning for approaches from the darkened area behind the service bays where someone might emerge from shadows with capabilities that exceeded normal civilian limitations. Daryl's approach was textbook perfect, the kind of tactical movement that required hundreds of hours of training to execute correctly under stress. He covered the final 15 feet in near-perfect silence, timing his movement to coincide with the sound of struggling from near the van's front where Evelyn was still fighting against her captors. The noise provided auditory cover that masked any residual sound from his approach. The takedown was equally professional. A precisely applied blood choke that rendered the attacker unconscious in less than 4 seconds, with force directed in ways that avoided permanent injury while ensuring immediate incapacitation. The man simply folded into Daryl's arms like someone falling asleep, his body weight controlled and lowered silently to the asphalt. 1 down, 5 to go. The second attacker noticed his colleague's absence approximately 30 seconds later, turning to check on the rear security position and finding empty space where his partner should have been stationed. His reaction was exactly what Daryl had anticipated: confusion rather than alarm. followed by movement toward the last known position to investigate what appeared to be a tactical error rather than external threat. This attacker was eliminated with equal efficiency, but different technique. A precisely targeted strike to nerve clusters had induced immediate unconsciousness without visible injury. Daryl caught the falling body and arranged it behind a fuel pump where it wouldn't be immediately visible to the remaining attackers, but would be easily found by emergency responders. 2 down, 4 to go. The mathematics of the situation were shifting rapidly in favor of the defender. Professional kidnappers operated on the principle of overwhelming force and rapid execution. Their effectiveness depended on maintaining numerical superiority and psychological control over both victim and environment. As those advantages eroded, their operational confidence would begin to fragment, leading to decision-making errors that could be exploited by someone with appropriate training. The third attacker fell to a combination approach that Daryl executed with the kind of precision that spoke of constant practice and absolute confidence in technique. A diversionary sound drew attention in the wrong direction, creating an opening for approach and elimination that followed the same pattern as the previous 2 encounters. Unconsciousness, controlled descent, concealment of evidence. 3 down, 3 to go. By this point, the remaining attackers were beginning to recognize that their operation was experiencing unexpected complications. The leader's body language had shifted from confident control to alert concern, as he realized that half of his team had disappeared without explanation or communication. His tactical experience was sufficient to understand that such systematic elimination of personnel indicated the presence of hostile capability that exceeded random civilian interference. Evelis had stopped struggling, not from exhaustion but from the growing realization that something was happening beyond her understanding. The men holding her were displaying increasing tension, their attention divided between victim control and environmental assessment. Their whispered communications had acquired the urgent tone of people whose carefully planned operation was encountering variables that hadn't been accounted for in their preparation. The fourth attacker was eliminated while attempting to investigate his missing colleagues, following predictable patterns of movement that made interdiction relatively straightforward for someone who understood how professional teams operated under stress. His unconscious form joined the others in concealment positions that would allow easy location by responding officers while maintaining operational security during the remainder of the engagement. 4 down, 2 to go. At this point, the fundamental dynamic of the situation had reversed completely. Instead of 6 attackers controlling 1 victim, 2 increasingly panicked kidnappers